Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Mom's Favorites Books My Mother Loved, a memorial for my mother. We are starting a new series which I am going to work through at a slow pace. It's going to be at the usual pace for those of you who are watching these videos, but I read the first two books in this series many, many years ago, and I decided that I was done with them at the time. So this is not books that I'm particularly looking forward to revisiting, though I have read, as I said, two of them. Um, the thing is, before we start, I feel I should say that my mother was a huge fan of Arthuriana. What is Arthuriana? Well, it's stuff about King Arthur. The thing about King Arthur, of course, is that there is some historical evidence that there was probably a king in Britain at some point who kind of had a history kind of like Arthur. But it's very much something like Robin Hood, where Robin Hood is a composite of a bunch of different outlaws throughout history, and a bunch of things that got magnified, and a bunch of stuff about King Richard, and somebody sort of glued it all together and eventually created a story which has withstood the test of time, because the idea of an outlaw who steals from the rich to give to the poor, who is working to bring home the rightful King of England, and all that kind of stuff. It's a very dramatic tale that a lot of people look on, that sort of, it really, really speaks to people. And Arthur is another one of those concepts, grouped concepts, that really, really speak to people. The idea of this good king who is just like the greatest thing ever, and the golden age of King Arthur when everything was wonderful, and when you had these knights of the round table, because a round table doesn't have a head or a foot, thus ensuring that nobody can claim any particular precedence over anybody else. Although, I'll be honest, anyone who knows anything about orders of seating knows that that's actually probably kind of a lie. But the theoretical concept of King Arthur, who is sitting at a table with his knights, and because there is no head or foot of the table, he is therefore amongst equals despite being the king, and his being chosen by the Lady of the Lake, or by Excalibur, or by Caliburn, or all the variations of how one would treat this. And the thing about King Arthur is that that's much like the story of Robin Hood, something that sort of gets created during the medieval period, and then builds and builds, and sort of reaches, one suspects, a kind of a heyday during the Victorian era, as people sort of expanded outward until they had created this standardized plot. And then over the course of the 20th century, you had various people who looked at things at different angles. You have the series that I can now no longer remember either the author of or the book title, because I read it but I can't remember it, that focuses on Morgan Le Fay. You have Disney's Sword in the Stone, where we have this story of a very, very young Arthur who is sort of helped on his way by elderly Merlin. You have all kinds of variations in all kinds of places. You have the rebirth of the king. You have the fact that evocative notion that both King Arthur and Merlin are supposed to be sleeping, hidden somewhere in Britain, to be revived at a time when they are needed. They're very evocative ideas. Mary Stewart decided, with The Crystal Cave and the books that came after, to tell a story of where Merlin came from. And it's not history. She is very, very emphatic in her follow-up author's note that this should not be seen as being history, that she is not trying to be historically accurate. Among the things that she discusses is the fact that she doesn't try to dig out the names that people would have been using at the time, precisely because with the previous Roman invasions, with the Saxons, with everything that had gone on in Britain, all the people who had gone through Britain, most places had 3 or 4 names depending on who you talked to. And so part of what she was trying to do was to give it the sense of people who were talking to each other, who were contemporaries. That is, the way I would form a sentence is not the way one would have formed a sentence 100 years ago, 200 years ago. And even factoring in that this is taking place somewhere in, like, 400 AD or something like that. In spite of the fact that this is something in there, you have this concept of her saying, that people speak to each other in a vernacular, in common parlance, in informal ways, and though the English of yesteryear, or French, or in this case Latin and Cornish and what have you, of however many hundred years ago this is being set in, while that might have odd formalities or turns of phrase or what have you, people speak to each other as people, and therefore, to a certain extent, in order to make these into real people rather than people speaking strangely, she's put in emphasis on the vernacular. She has taken names, and in a lot of cases, she said, this place which is called this, which in later years was called that, so that people can find locations on maps, something that is particularly problematic, after all, for those of us in North America, who, if you say Carmarthen, we have no idea where the hell that is. We might, if we're lucky, be able to say somewhere in Wales, but if you're going to ask me where in Wales, I can't tell you. I can tell you probably sort of nearish the ocean, but then again, I live in Canada, and sort of nearish the ocean is a different thing than in the UK, which in Wales in particular, which are small enough that you can be nearish the ocean from the Canadian perspective basically all the time. I genuinely don't know where it is, and I haven't bothered to look it up before recording this. Like I said, Wales isn't awfully specific in the grand scheme of things. So, when she mentions these places, she's sort of trying to make it easier if you decide to look it up on a map. And indeed, there is a map just on the inside of the book. On my copy, for reasons I am not entirely sure of, although I suspect it mostly printing area, the map on the front page flyleaf is upside down. So there you go. But basically what you have is she doesn't call places... some places she calls by their old names, but a lot of them she calls by their modern names simply for the purposes of people being able to figure out where they are geographically in the book. In my case, of course, I usually just go along with, and they went that a ways, because honestly, to me, it doesn't really matter. What's interesting in this, of course, is that this is one of those things that I suppose could be termed magic realism. In this, Merlin doesn't have magical superpowers. This is not Merlin from Disney. This is not Merlin from that TV show they had about 10 years ago, give or take, however many years, with that was called Merlin, in which Anthony Stewart had played Uther Pendragon, in which I actually never watched. But the point is that this is a Merlin who has visions. He sees the future and the past and whatever it is that the powers that be that he has identified as the god, whatever they choose to show him, and occasionally he makes prophecy, which he is not entirely conscious of, except that he sort of comes out of it and realizes he's been saying stuff and asks people what he said, and nobody tells him these things. And sometimes he just knows stuff, but his powers are math. He's an engineer. He's able to move one of the stones from Ireland and haul it all the way back to Stonehenge, not because he's got magic powers, but because he's an engineer, and a very, very good one. He doesn't have magic powers over life and death. He's just studied with every single doctor he can get his hands on. He doesn't have magic powers with brews or what have you. It's just that he has studied things and stuff and knows a lot of languages. And of course, in a time when so many people were illiterate, in a time when there is so much ignorance and lack of knowledge and everything else, somebody who has this knowledge can come across as being magical. So while he does have some magic, it's a magic that really seems to come out in visions. There are intimations at the start of the book, of this first book, that he at some point demonstrated the ability to, make fire appear and stuff like that, but at this point, he is fairly young. He is perhaps in his late teens, early 20s by the end of this book, and his powers have pretty much been prophecy and being really smart. But that said, this book is extremely bleak. This is about the bastard son of somebody who eventually becomes the king of Britain, however briefly. It's about actions that he took that in the end have potentially caused, that could be seen as causing ruin for Uther and the woman that Uther fell in love with. And there's a bunch of this, and it's a really bleak sort of perspective, and I recall the second book not getting much better. And it's interesting, but there's a part of me that dislikes it because while Arthur ends in tragedy with Mordred and the betrayal of Lancelot with Guinevere and the fall of, and the hunt for the Holy Grail and the fall of Camelot and all of that stuff, there's this moment of time when everything is amazing and wonderful, and one would have wished that these books would sort of move upward before moving downward. And while I have not reread the first two in many years and didn't bother to read the others, it's something that felt bleak, and I suspect will continue to be bleak all the way to the end. So I'm not looking forward to it because, frankly, I don't like sad books. It's very well written. If you like Arthur stuff, it's an excellent piece of Arthuriana. It's an interesting take on Merlin. It's an interesting take on how Arthur came about. But they're not really happy books. And I think that's all I have to say. So that's everything, and I will see you all next week.